Ozarks, in a remote mountain region of Missouri, deep in the Ozarks, lies a story few know and even fewer dare to tell. Here, among deep valleys and dense forests that block the sun, families lived in isolation for generations, crafting their own world with its own rules. It was in 1978 that a rural doctor, Dr. Robert Liston, first documented the case of the Whittaker sisters, a Sodos and 2-4 born between 1932 and 1937. Eleanor, Margaret, and Ruth were the daughters of first cousins, who themselves descended from a family line with centuries of intermarriage. Upon my first visit to that property, I noted something peculiar. Dr. Liston wrote in his medical diary, now held at the University of Missouri. The curtains remained drawn even in daytime. I was greeted by the eldest brother, Thomas, the only one seemingly without visible deformities. Hono $47, what the doctor discovered inside that isolated home would haunt him for the rest of his career. All three sisters bore severe facial deformities, misaligned jaws, asymmetrical eyes, cranial malformations, and extreme dental problems. Zoe one's hide wore few more striking still. Each of them wore handmade cloth masks, even indoors, even in the presence of family. Eleanor, the eldest, was the first to remove her mask so I could examine her. Liston recounted, the flash of pain in her eyes when she saw my initial reaction stays with me to this day. Zoe 1 scene 3 tooth. Medical analysis revealed the Whittaker sisters suffered from mandibulofacial dysostosis, a rare genetic condition often linked to Treacher-Collins syndrome, but with uniquely severe manifestations due to generations of consanguineous marriage. Parish records and local censuses later confirmed at least 7 generations of cousin weddings within the family. CO11 and 57, the outside world remained unaware of the sisters until 1983, when a brief mention in a regional medical journal caught the scientific community's attention. Yet the family steadfastly refused any public exposure, shielding the sisters from social scrutiny. The story of the Whittaker sisters is no isolated case. So through 2010s rather, it illustrates a broader phenomenon in America's isolated rural communities, where geographical, cultural, and religious isolation created conditions for consanguineous marriage practices to persist long after they were abandoned elsewhere. Be sure you're subscribed to this channel. So 241's cases like the Whittaker sisters are seldom documented with such depth, and our research brings to light stories society often prefers to forget. To fully grasp the tragedy of women who hid their faces behind masks, we must understand the science behind their condition. Dr. James Warren, a geneticist at Columbia University who studied similar cases in 1992, explains, consanguinity itself does not create new mutations. Yo 309. What it does is increase the likelihood that harmful recessive genes, which would typically remain dormant across generations, are expressed when the same genetic variant is inherited from both parents. For the Whittaker sisters specifically, later genetic analysis revealed an extraordinary concentration of deleterious recessive alleles, a perfect genetic storm that resulted in their severe deformities. Zo 3734 of medical records from Shannon County, Missouri, preserved in the State Historical Archive, show that between 1920 and 1970, the incidence of congenital defects in this region was 47% higher than the national average. A 1965 public health report, kept classified for decades for fear of stigmatizing the community, documented clusters of congenital malformations within specific families. CEO 402, the communities of the Ozarks developed a triple isolation, explains anthropologist Dr. Sarah McKenzie, who has studied the region for 20 years. First, geographic isolation due to poor roads and rugged terrain. Second, cultural isolation marked by deep distrust of outsiders. 0426 third, genetic isolation with a limited pool of potential partners. This isolation was not accidental. Historical records indicate many of these families deliberately fled the scrutiny of broader society. The Whittakers, for example, descended from settlers who came to the region in the 1830s, intentionally choosing remote land to avoid religious persecution. Fazo 4747, the community developed marriage customs that favored unions within the same family circle, often justified by particular religious interpretations and a desire to keep land within the family. Local church documents from 1875 show a pastor defending marriages between cousins as blessed by the Lord to maintain the purity of the lineage. As 05 Winters in 1952, when Eleanor Whittaker was 20, an itinerant doctor offered surgical treatment to alleviate her deformities. The family refused. According to Dr. Liston's notes, they viewed the girl's condition not as an illness, but as a divine trial to be endured with dignity. The masks emerged as a practical solution. Initially made by the girl's mother and later by themselves, the masks were carefully sewn from dark fabric, covering most of the face with openings only for the eyes. 05542 rare photographs preserved in Dr. Liston's medical archive show the masks were surprisingly elaborate, with embroidered details that suggested an idealized face. The tragic paradox is that the very isolation that contributed to their condition also shielded them from the cruel social scrutiny they would surely have faced in the outside world. The 0604 in the few interviews given to Dr. Liston between 1978 and 1985, gathered in his confidential medical archive and partially released for research in 2010. The Whittaker sisters revealed fragments of their extraordinary lives. Margaret, the middle sister, described their daily routine. We rise before dawn to do the outdoor chores. Says 0628, it's better to work in the dark. The three sisters developed a meticulous system to minimize their exposure. They kept a garden in the back of the property, surrounded by tall trees, and raised chickens and goats. Animals that, they noted, did not care about appearances. Brother Thomas handled all outside interactions, shopping in town, negotiations, bank affairs. The 0653, Eleanor was the finest seamstress I ever knew, said an elderly neighbor in 1992, who had occasionally traded eggs for embroidery with the family. I never saw her face, but her hands created true works of art. The Whittaker house, documented in rare county file photos, was a two-story structure with small windows and permanently drawn curtains. 07 and was exceed the interior, by all accounts, was remarkably orderly and clean, with mirrors conspicuously absent. The living room walls displayed photographs of distant ancestors from generations before the severe deformities appeared. Ruth, the youngest sister, kept a detailed diary, part of which is preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives. As 0740 aired in a 1965 entry, she wrote, "Today I saw my reflection in the well water for a moment in the twilight. It almost looked normal. I dreamed of what it might be like to walk through town without causing shouts or having people turn away." The masks became more than mere coverings. They were alternative identities. Say 80,000, each sister had several masks for different occasions. Eleanor, the most skilled with needle and thread, created masks with subtly different expressions. One with a slight smile for special days, another more neutral for everyday wear. Most extraordinary, wrote Dr. Liston, is that even when alone at home, they rarely removed the masks. CEO 8's Margaret explained to me they had grown so accustomed to wearing them that they felt naked without. The handful of visitors who entered the home, primarily Dr. Liston and occasionally the local pastor, reported that the sisters seemed to have developed an elaborate body language to compensate for their limited facial expression. CO 84's hand gestures, tilts of the head, and variations in posture communicated emotions their covered faces could not. Medical records indicate that beyond their facial deformities, the sisters suffered secondary health problems. Eleanor had severe scoliosis. Margaret experienced progressive hearing loss, and Ruth endured chronic respiratory issues. C-09-06, all conditions consistent with syndromes linked to prolonged consanguinity. If you too feel the weight of this story, leave a comment now. Behind every mask is a soul that longs for dignity. The lives of these women remind us how acceptance and compassion are gifts many have never received. The Whittaker sisters' story, though extraordinary, is not unique. A lower 1929 research conducted by the Institute of Human Genetics at Hopkins University between 1985 and 1997 identified at least 27 family clusters with similar chimericas with similar patterns of genetic isolation and high rates of consanguineous marriage resulting in severe genetic conditions. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Helen Edwards documented the case of the veiled women in an isolated community in Mexico's Chihuahua Mountains. As 09-5 5 women from the same extended family had facial deformities similar to the Whittakers and adopted similar concealment practices. Dr. Edwards noted, the masks evolved into part of their cultural identity, transforming a necessity into a tradition. In the Appalachian region spanning several eastern U.S. states, a study of isolated communities conducted between 1970 and 1982 identified multiple instances of congenital malformations in communities with high rates of endogamy. The study, controversial at the time for its ethical and social implications, remained partially confidential until 2005. 45 in the Melungeon community, an isolated racial Appalachian population. Cases were documented in Hancock County, Tennessee. Rural Dr. William Kennedy recorded in 1963. I encountered 4 adult women wearing permanent veils, all of the same family line. Locals respect their privacy, but outsiders often react with cruelty. Llywelyn in Nova Scotia, Canada. The small community of Fisher's Harbor was home to the MacDonald sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and remained profoundly isolated. The 3 sisters, born in the 1940s, had severe facial deformities due to multiple generations of cousin marriage. See 1131 parish records confirm 7 first cousin marriages in just 3 generations. The isolation of these communities was not only geographical but also informational. A review of Appalachian medical records by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988 revealed that basic information about the genetic risks of consanguineous marriage rarely reached these isolated areas. While in 1958, when it did, it was often dismissed as outside interference in long-standing traditions. In a 1990 interview with the journal Frontiers in Genetics, a woman identified only as MS from an isolated Kentucky community, who also wore a mask to hide severe facial deformities, said, "No one told us marrying cousins could cause problems. It was just what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face grew differently, they thought it was just misfortune." 12-21. A consistent pattern emerges from these disparate cases. Geographical isolation created conditions for genetic isolation, often reinforced by religious or cultural beliefs, favoring marriage within the community or family. 12-47 subsequent social stigma then deepened that isolation, creating a cycle that persisted for generations. Dr. Paul Bergman, a geneticist who studied multiple such cases, observed in 1990, the most disturbing aspect is not the genetic condition itself, but how the response to it often compounded the suffering of affected families. 13 Hirudan. Public health records show that in many instances, basic medical interventions that could have eased complications were either refused or never offered. Isolation, initially a cause of their conditions, also became a barrier to treatment. Investigative journalist Michael Harkins, who attempted to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote, "I found closed doors, unreturned calls, and occasionally veiled threats. These communities learn through painful experience that exposure rarely helps and often brings humiliation." Consider 13,400 anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who has studied isolated communities for 3 decades, notes, "The use of masks, veils, or other concealment became more than a practical response to physical deformity. So 1405, in many cases, it evolved into a distinct cultural expression, almost an act of resistance against a world that rejected them." Time did not stand still in the Ozarks. In 1987, Eleanor Whittaker passed away at 55 from respiratory complications, a secondary condition related to her craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at age 61. So 1430, Ruth, the youngest, lived until 2002, dying at 65. The family home, abandoned after the death of Ruth and brother Thomas in 1998, stood for years as a silent monument to lives lived in shadow. In 2008, a fire destroyed the structure, taking with it the last physical traces of this extraordinary family. The 1453, yet the legacy of the Whittaker sisters and women like them persists in unexpected ways. In 1992, the Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established, partly inspired by cases documented by Dr. Liston. The foundation provides surgical treatment and psychological support for children and adults with severe facial malformations. A 1575, Dr. Rachel Cohen, a plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, remarked in 2007, "Cases like the Whittaker sisters show us the human cost of failures in our health and social support systems." Today, many such conditions can be treated with relatively straightforward surgical interventions, if caught early. 1539 advances in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostics mean many of the ailments that afflicted them can now be prevented or managed. Still, the social stigma associated with facial difference persists, albeit in subtler forms. The discovery in 1999 of several original Whittaker sisters masks, preserved by a neighbor after Ruth's death, 1673s, offered profound insight. The masks, now part of the University of Missouri's permanent collection, reveal extraordinary craftsmanship made with multiple layers of carefully stitched fabric. Each mask bears subtly defined facial characteristics, contours of cheeks, suggestions of lips, even embroidered eyebrows. The 1624. These are not simple utilitarian coverings, noted museum curator Dr. Elizabeth Chen. They are attempts to recreate the facial normality genetics denied them. There is a moving dignity in this effort. In a rare 1980 interview with Dr. Liston, Ruth Whittaker explained the masks, meaning to her and her sisters. 1646, "People think we wear them to hide ourselves, and that's partly true. But we also wear them to reveal ourselves as we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I will be that day. It is a power my real face never gave me." Ruth's diary, spanning nearly 4 decades, offers moving glimpses of a reflective, deeply sensitive woman. So 1709, in a 1972 entry, she wrote, "Some believe we live tragic lives, trapped in this house with these faces. But we know joy too, when Eleanor plays the piano at dusk, when Margaret tells stories that make us weep with laughter, when Thomas returns from town with a new book to read together. In those moments, I forget the masks entirely." 1730, in isolated rural communities, consanguineous marriage practices have declined dramatically in recent decades due to increased mobility, access to education, and awareness of genetic risks. Yet in some remote parts of the Americas, genetic isolation remains a public health concern. The 1750, a 2018 study on marriage patterns in isolated communities, published by the National Institutes of Health, documented an 87% reduction in first-cousin marriages in U.S. rural areas since 1950. However, the same study identified pockets where endogamous practices persist, particularly in communities with strong religious or cultural isolation. So 1823, the stories of women who lived behind masks remind us of the enduring power of social stigma and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in adversity. As Ruth Whittaker wrote in her diary in a 1997 entry, "Behind this mask, I have lived a full life. Limited in some ways, yes, but rich in others. I have known love, beauty, and purpose. What more can anyone ask? So 181036, if you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "Watched here," so I can get to know you and see who truly follows the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See 1855 stories that uncover forgotten aspects of our shared humanity. Please like this video to support this work of historical documentation and share it with someone who values understanding the full complexity of human experience.